Hi, everybody. Welcome to IS 311. My name is Bill L. Smith. I'm the director of the Martin Institute and Program in International Studies here at the University of Idaho. I've been here for 15 years, a little bit more than that actually, and I'm really excited to talk about the United Nations because it essentially encompasses all the countries in the world and all issues being discussed in the world all at the same time in one nice package. So we can have the opportunity to sort of lay out a framework, which is the United Nations, its structure, its pros, its cons, strengths and weaknesses, etc., and then talk about almost anything you want, study almost anything you want, because the UN is working on all of those things. And if you look at individual countries, many of them are working on all of those things as well. So my role in international studies is to teach along what we would call the spine of an interdisciplinary degree. So we have international studies majors and minors here at the University of Idaho. We have a bachelor's degree and a minor. And in both, our job is to sort of help people with the framework of international studies. So international studies is an interdisciplinary degree. It's one that encompasses lots of fields where we don't believe that it's of particular import to have a single set of training in any individual discipline, but to have parts of lots of disciplines that come together as a whole. So you can't just do things sort of dissociated from each other, but there has to be a spine, a collective approach to studying things that ties all these ideas together. That's our job at IS. My job as director of the Institute, and with my colleagues who are faculty here in IS, we do the same thing. We're going to try and give you frameworks within which you can study lots of different things and bring in different sorts of perspectives. This class will be interesting because we'll start with this framework that everyone will follow along in the first couple of units, and thereafter we'll be going lots of different directions in units 3 and 4. So yes, this is a course introduction, and we're going to talk about why studying the UN at UI is so cool, and I'm going to leave you with bated breath until we get to that part of the conversation. All right, so we're going to start here in New York City. New York City is the headquarters, hosts the headquarters of the United Nations. It's a particular challenge for the city. In fact, the mayor's office has someone who's one of his most important staff members. Their job is basically as a UN liaison. You may know that in the United States, we are part of a treaty mechanisms that sort of trade our rights. We'll talk about this here in the upcoming lectures. Trade our rights to do whatever we want to do to other countries to prevent them from doing whatever they want to do. And we'll talk about this in the context of sovereignty over benefits, but one of the things we discuss is what rights diplomats should have. So the United States and the other countries in the world have agreed that diplomats will have certain immunities from prosecution and won't be subject to arrest, which makes things a lot smoother when you send a diplomat abroad. You know that they'll be safe. Well, usually that pertains primarily to national capitals, so that would be in Washington, D.C., but New York City actually hosts a very complex organization in the UN because it has not just diplomats from individual accredited countries. You see the flags of a lot of the countries going across the front here. Hopefully you see the really cool rainbow angled flag of the Seychelles there right underneath the UN flag. That's one of my favorites, very interesting flag. But you also have diplomats who work for the United Nations in this giant building here. So this is a picture of the UN headquarters. The smaller concrete building on the left is the houses a lot of the meeting halls where when the countries get together. So scattered around the city itself are embassies or permanent missions where diplomatic staffs work from individual countries. They come in and go into this edifice here and do some very interesting sorts of work. And the tall glass building here are diplomats who are accredited to the UN itself. They work for something called the Secretariat, which we'll look at here again later. They're also diplomats. So whereas in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., you have diplomats from the countries. In New York, you have the diplomats from the countries and from the UN. So you need this special liaison from the city to figure out how to handle all those folks because it's in Manhattan and New York City, and that borough is a very congested place to start with, and you add all of the peculiarities of having diplomats with immunity all living in the city, and it can present some interesting challenges. So welcome to New York. A lot of what we talk about will be based here, but as you'll learn throughout the semester, there's other sub-headquarters of the UN. I don't know if you can have a sub-headquarters, but anyway, other places where certain parts of the UN are based. There's some in Geneva, there's some in Nairobi in Kenya, there's one in Rome, and there's several others scattered around, which we'll talk about. So in the United States, when people talk about the UN, it's usually, if they have an opinion at all, a lot of people have no opinion at all, it's in two contexts. And one is it's a pernicious threat to the United States and to our sovereignty. Again, we'll talk about sovereignty lots this semester. It'll be an overarching theme as we go through all kinds of different topics about what it means to join an intergovernmental organization, what it means for sovereignty and the application thereof. So a lot of people think the UN is pernicious, and this sort of ebbs and flows. And when I was first studying the UN, It wasn't such something that we were particularly worried about in terms of sort of a one world government, which is sort of a theme that conspiracy theorists talk about. But we were certainly concerned in the 1980s when I was in high school and college about the role of communists in the United Nations and whether we were surrendering our sovereignty to communist states who are ideological enemies at the time. But there's a lot of people who still are very against the UN today. It's very difficult to get a large segment of the United States population interested in doing work with the UN. The work continues on nonetheless because there are 193 member states as of January 2016, and those other groups are ongoing. So there's another group of people in the United States who think that the UN is a panacea, that it can solve all of society's ills. Now, that's interesting because as I said before, the UN's working on almost all issues. This is a list, a picture, a visual pictogram of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the UN and the larger global community will be working on for the next 15 years through 2030. So you can see the breadth there. The breadth there would suggest that they think that you can solve everything, or at least work on everything, so that maybe it's a panacea. Obviously, there may not be a happy medium, but there's something in between these two poles, and we'll be studying that this semester. So you may, if you go home or are just talking to folks, say, hey, I'm taking a class on the United Nations today. They may fall into one of these two categories. When you're in Idaho, there may be more folks who may be in the pernicious sort of category. I do remember about 15 years ago, the city of Post Falls had a resolution introduced through the city council to make Post Falls a UN free zone. I remember the mayor saying he was a little bit confused because, as far as he knew, there was nobody in Post Falls who worked for the UN, or that the city didn't do any business with the UN. But there was this nascent movement in the early 2000s to try and get the US out of the UN, and Post Falls was one of the places they tried it. It didn't work. December of 2011, I'm sorry, 2001, it was voted down. But there is this undercurrent in Idaho. Certainly, I used to get a phone call from a prominent citizen in Lewiston who would call me and suggest that the Institute host some people to come talk about the problems with the UN. But as you'll see, we have a purpose in the Martin Institute and in International Studies, and our purpose is not to promote the UN or to condemn the UN. It's to talk to you about the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of the UN, and in particular, to look at the causes of war and the conditions necessary for peace as they apply in the international system, and then to look at how countries act and interact in the international system. So you've got all the countries of the world, 193 as of January 2016, from largest to smallest, all interacting at the UN on all global issues. So for our purposes, we use the UN as a framework to study all of these topics. We will and need to be concerned with whether the organization is basically a force for good or evil, but that's pretty simplistic. So we're more interested in where it is strong, where it is weak, and where our country, the United States, or others, if you're looking at it from a different perspective, need to be cautious or embrace what the UN has to offer. I don't have all the answers for you. I don't believe that there's a single answer on how to approach this. Therefore, I'll work on helping you with the patterns, and you'll be able to determine what you feel about the UN as we go through, and your ideas may change over the coming years. I don't know that. Now, why is it so cool to study at the University of Idaho? Meet Boyd Martin. So when I say I work for the Martin Institute, and also I'll be part-time, at least for the next several years, director of the Martin School of Global Studies, there's a name for Boyd Martin, who was a political science professor from Kamiah, Idaho. Kamiah is a small town here in the Panhandle area. As you go towards Cottonwood, it is a place where there's lots of farming take place. He's from the farming community. He was a political science who got his bachelor's degree here at the University of Idaho and his PhD at Stanford University, and he came back here and worked as a professor at the University of Idaho, as a dean at the University of Idaho, and then as the founder of an institute at the University of Idaho. He and his wife Grace is pictured here on the right with Boyd late in their life. They were young newlyweds in 1939, listening to the radio when they were in Stanford, California, Palo Alto, listening to the reports of the Germans under Hitler invading Poland. They were disturbed by this, as a lot of people in the world were, and they determined that they would accrue a savings over the course of their lives that they would use to endow an institute that would study the causes of war and the conditions necessary for peace. Okay, so that's cool in and of itself, because they did that. Obviously, they accomplished it by the end of their life. Also, though, in 1945, when the United States was going to send a delegation to San Francisco to the negotiations that led to the ratification, signing and ratification of the UN Charter, which lays out the UN's powers and limitations. The President of the United States, Harry Truman, called Boyd Martin on the phone and asked him to go and help serve on that delegation. So we actually have a University of Idaho tie directly to the drafting of the charter. So one of the things that Boyd was very interested in is how the UN functions today. The anecdote goes that, in those days in 1945, faculty members and departments had secretaries, not administrative assistants or people who worked the front office, who actually typed up documents and put through phone calls and the like. And he got a phone call from the president, and he believed it was the president of the university, but it was in fact the president of the United States asking him to serve on Senator Vandenberg of Minnesota's staff. So we have that connection. So when we talk about the UN Charter, when we talk about the United Nations, we have a legacy with the University of Idaho that goes all the way back to the founding of the organization itself, which I think is pretty cool. And I don't know there's a lot of schools where you could say that. Some have people who were representative later on in United Nations diplomacy and action and negotiations, but we go way back to 1945. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about how countries act and interact on a wide range of issues. So yes, this is your takeaway. And when I go through these lectures, they'll be between 10 and 15 minutes each. Make sure you write down the takeaway in your notes and say, hey, I get it. This is what we're looking at in this unit, and you can go back and sort of fill in the gaps. This is our ideal. The ideal is not that the UN is a panacea. The ideal is that it's a vehicle through which we can study all the countries in the world and all the topics therein. Let's see. Last thing to wrap up, I want to emphasize that I am here on campus. I'm in the administration building, room 338. That's the Martin Institute. I'm online. bills@uidaho.edu is my email address. I'd like to engage with people in this class. I'd like to engage after you've been in this class and continue to have conversations with you. I don't have all the answers, but I have lots more questions, and we can explore and figure out what we know and what we don't know, and that's what we'll do. Cheers.